Development and Humanitarian Expert Dr. Hodan Ali is co-founder of LeadNow, Somali Women's political pressure group. She joins us from Washington, D.C. in the USA to talk about this. Just how dire is the situation?
Well, thank you for having me. Extremely dire, critical, especially in certain parts of Somalia. South Central Somalia, the Bai region is really facing yet another devastating famine-like conditions. I think it's important that the world pays attention and that the Somali government, collectively, and the Somali people heed the call to action.
And I mean, we hear that millions of people are facing hunger due to the drought in the Horn of Africa. We've also mentioned the conflict situation, but these are stories we've been hearing for a couple of months now of people walking long distances with children on their shoulders, on their backs to escape the drought and the violence. But what has been done about it since the call was made? The United Nations Secretary General raised the alarm, as well as we mentioned the WHO Director General. So what needs to be done to galvanize people into urgent action?
I think the growing apathy of the situation across the Horn of Africa, over 40 million people facing severe food shortages, but particularly in Somalia, we have now nearly 365,000 children malnourished. We have 7 million people food insecure. In addition to that, 1 million people have been now internally displaced, adding to 2.5 million internally displaced from prior. Now, the climate estimate is that we're going to have a fifth rain season failure, which culminates to really imminent sort of life loss. I mean, ultimately, I think what we need to do is mobilize not only the global community but also locally at home. I think there is a bit of disoriented approach to what's happening on the ground. This is not new. The same region in 2011 suffered famine. We lost over 260,000 people. In 2016, 2017, we had massive droughts that are sort of, these cumulative rain failures are adding up to and depleting people's resilience. Somalia, as you know, almost 90% of the people are agro-pastoralists, and diversification of how they live has not been really mapped out. And I think now that we are in a crisis point, we have been in this crisis for a bit, the lack of collective understanding and support to the people of Somalia, the 7 million people, but particularly the nearly 500,000 people now who are seriously malnourished, will end up in a couple of months' time, in famine-like conditions. So, I mean, obviously, there's a lot of movements that we're seeing now. We saw the USA administrator coming to Somalia. We had the UN relief chief coming to Somalia in the last couple of weeks. But I also want to remind the international partners and community and Somalis and Africans in the Horn of Africa, this is not new. We need to start thinking about how we got here and how do we move forward, given the climate crisis that everywhere the world is dealing with, but particularly it disproportionately affects these marginalized and poor communities in the Horn of Africa.
And a very important point that you raised there, as you mentioned, for failed seasons of rain. So it's the worst drought in, the last 4 decades. But from a global international community, stance, we talk a lot about climate change, particularly from the UN, early warning systems that are functioning. Somalia's government has not been functioning at its optimum for a very long time. So, as you say, this has been happening incrementally. For half of Somalia's population to be in danger, it means the signs, the early warning signs that nature gives us, are being ignored.
Absolutely. And then I think, a year ago, 2 years ago, in 2016, 2017, when a near famine was averted, this should have been alerting those who are in charge of making sure the humanitarian sector of Somalia becomes more robust and actually support people in their communities and sort of support not just life-saving opportunities, but really making sure people are able to, live decently and actually have their livelihoods intact, and that resilience that we talk about. But this is not happening in a vacuum. We look at globally what's happening with the Ukraine war, what's happening with the lack of grains that are accessible to the rest of the world, and also the fact that obviously a lot of money is being pumped into different places around the world, which makes access for humanitarian funds more harder to get. But ultimately, I do think, it behooves African leaders, Somali leaders, to actually really take hold of what is happening now, given that, we do live in a global politics now that sort of prioritizes, unfortunately, not black and brown lives, and then ultimately I think we need to understand that how do we move forward, avert famine in Somalia, but also food security is a huge issue as we see what's happening in Pakistan with the massive floods that are happening. Global warming is real, climate change is real, and the communities that are being impacted are those who have not really contributed to this problem. And it's unfortunate that the resources available are not actually prioritized to these countries. And that is sort of, the lack of equity, global equity that we know that's afforded to European lives, if I can say that in a more politically correct way.
What can be done in the immediate interim to plug the food gaps that are already evident? And, if we're working mid to long term to ensure that we're not saying this every 10 years, that there is another famine that is projected for Somalia?
It won't be another 10 years. It's going to be maybe 3, 4, 5 years. That's a sad reality. What needs to be done, I think there needs to be more focus by the Somali government to put institutions that are ready to tackle these issues in collaboration and support with the international community. I think the international community also needs to change its act on the ground, and it can no longer satisfy that the majority of the money received to support people goes through many, sort of supports non-intervention on the ground per se. So I think there's got to be a political will from the government and a political commitment from the international community to do things differently, because we know these issues will continue to wreak havoc and actually get worse. And like I said, this has been consecutive issues that are happening. And in the next couple of years, the outcomes will be a lot worse than we have seen so far, which is what we're seeing right now. We're seeing more people displaced, more people not food secure, more people leaving their communities to urban areas that already don't have the infrastructure, nor the support, nor the money to deal with these problems. So it is a crisis that is local, regional, and international. And I think all of those decisions around it need to come together and figure out a better way moving forward.
Much appreciated for your time. Development and Humanitarian Expert Dr. Hodan Ali, co-founder of LeadNow, that's a Somali Women's political pressure group.